There is a war in Ukraine. Russia attacked Ukraine on February 24. What is the Russian-Ukraine conflict about? Primarily about territorial claims, but also about economic interests. Ukraine, which is almost 100,000 square kilometers larger than Spain in terms of area, is wedged between the EU's eastern border of Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Russia. Until 1991, it was one of 15 Soviet republics, that is, part of the then vast Soviet Union. Since its dissolution, the former Soviet republics have been states in their own right. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia are now also members of the EU and Nato, but Ukraine is not. A larger part of the Ukrainian population would be in favor of their country joining the EU. Many people from Ukraine come to Germany, for example, to work here. Their labor is in demand as engineers, doctors, and teachers, but also in construction, elderly care, and cleaning. Many work in 24-hour care for the elderly, mostly illegally, poorly paid, and uninsured. In 2013, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians gathered in Kyiv for the Maidan protests. They demanded Ukraine's annexation to the EU. The police intervened violently against the demonstrators, but a mass movement emerged in which more than 100 demonstrators were killed in February 2014. Russia intervened and annexed the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea, which is part of eastern Ukraine. In doing so, Russia broke international treaties that stipulate respect for borders and territorial integrity. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine has not quieted down since then. In northeastern Ukraine, Ukrainian soldiers have been fighting Russian-equipped separatists for nearly 8 years. 2 internationally unrecognized republics have been declared around the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk. What is Russia's attitude? Since the spring of 2021, Russia has massively upgraded its military presence along the Ukrainian border. Thousands of soldiers have been stationed there. Russia justified this step by claiming that Ukraine was planning a military offensive in the Donetsk basin and had in turn massed thousands of soldiers there. No evidence for genocide allegation. Another claim by Russia, especially by President Putin, is that genocide is being perpetrated against the Russian minority in eastern Ukraine. But neither the OSCE nor the UN has any evidence of genocide. To be sure, statistics show that more civilians die on the separatist-controlled side than on the government side in the Donbass war. However, experts explain this with the choice of weapons, while the separatists mostly use snipers to eliminate targeted enemy soldiers. Large-caliber guns of the Ukrainian army kill civilians more often. At the same time, Russia has long demanded that NATO, the North Atlantic Defense Alliance, pledge not to admit any more eastern states. NATO should also refrain from military actions on the territory of Ukraine and other states in Eastern Europe, the South Caucasus, and Central Asia. In addition, both sides, Russia and NATO countries, are to refrain from deploying short and medium-range missiles at points that may pose a threat to the parties. What do NATO and the EU want? Western states have feared a Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine for weeks. The Western community of states warned Russia against violating its borders and repeatedly called for de-escalation. The annexation of Crimea is still considered illegal under international law by most Western countries. The European Union and the US imposed sanctions in the form of entry bans and account freezes against Russian and Ukrainian politicians and restricted trade. Russia then halted imports of agricultural products from the EU and the United States. However, Germany is dependent on Russian gas supplies, which currently cover around 40% of German gas consumption. Meanwhile, Great Britain continued to supply Ukraine with weapons. Germany has so far categorically refused to supply Ukraine with the weapons it wanted, a move that has been sharply criticized in Kyiv. What is meant when the alliance case is mentioned? In their 1949 North Atlantic Treaty, NATO members agreed on 14 points. Among them was Article 5, which stated that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. Each alliance country would then have to help and take such measures, including the use of armed force, as it deemed necessary. This principle is also known as Military Defense Alliance. Over the years, more and more countries joined NATO. But, very important, Ukraine is not a NATO member so far. NATO's eastward expansion to date, for example, through the member countries Latvia, Lithuania, or Romania, has repeatedly come under criticism. Russia repeatedly emphasized that NATO had once ruled out expansion to the east and perceived this as a provocation. The alliance case and the growth of NATO, among other things, have repeatedly led to the so-called balance of terror in history. In other words, the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis, among others, never resulted in a global military confrontation for fear of the other large armed force. Which side is Ukraine itself on? Ukraine's population is divided into a Western-oriented or strongly nationalist part and a pro-Russian part. In the eastern Ukrainian cities of Donetsk and Luhansk, people voted in favor of secession from Ukraine in a controversial referendum. A majority also voted in favor of joining Russia in the annexation of Crimea. In other parts of the country, however, there are strong anti-Russian movements. Violent clashes between the two camps have been taking place in eastern Ukraine for years, especially around the cities of Luhansk, Odessa, Kharkov, Sloyansk, and Donetsk. Ukrainian military and pro-Russian separatists fought each other. The conflict has caused many deaths and injuries over the years, and the living conditions of residents in the major eastern Ukrainian cities of Luhansk and Donetsk have deteriorated dramatically. The Ukrainian leadership increasingly vehemently demanded inclusion in a so-called Membership Action Plan of NATO, a kind of precursor to membership. What role does international law play in this? The humanitarian situation in Ukraine has thus continued to deteriorate in recent years. In the course of the tensions in the country and the conflicts with Russia, there is therefore repeated talk of the violation of international law. This is a legal system by which all states in the world must abide. One important component, for example, is the Declaration of Human Rights, according to which all people are equal and free. The basis for the legal order is the Charter of the United Nations, UN. The UN has 193 members, including Russia and Ukraine. If a state violates international law, sanctions can be imposed. Important to know, states that recognize international law are prohibited from attacking another state by warlike means. In any case, one can only hope that this terrible war in Ukraine will soon come to an end and Russia will find its way back to a peaceful path.